My name's Joe, I'm from Old Colwyn in North Wales, and I run the social media channel Tirlun, where I explore Welsh place names and the stories, the history and the meanings behind them. Tirlun, it means landscape in Welsh, and there's a couple of words for landscape in Welsh. So you've got tirwedd, which is tir, land, and gwedd, which is the outside surface of something. So like attitude is agwedd, for example. And that kind of implies a more physical understanding of the landscape. But Tirlun is made of tir as in land, and llyn, which is like an image or a representation of it. And because I film a lot of the landscape, I thought that kind of fitted, but it also means like a landscape is in the painting style, which I like to think kind of is in the same ballpark as what I do. But it's also like the form as in like the mental form of something. So your mental image of the landscape in your head. So, you know, the stories of, oh, well, this is where I grew up and this is my area and this is the pub where my uncle did X, Y and Z and this is the road I used to walk to school, that kind of thing. I feel it's it means landscape fundamentally, but it's got some nicer implications than just tirwedd. I've been doing it for about a year and a half. I started off and it was very, very basic. It was on TikTok mostly, and it was just me talking to a camera. But over the last year and a half, my style's changed quite significantly, and I've been learning a lot on the way, and I'm still learning quite a lot actually. I've tried to do about a video a day. Obviously I can't quite get to that, but over a year and a half, I think about 350, 400 maybe. I've got a list, I've got the master list, I've got it in a map form on my computer. Essentially, I've got a list of about 5,600 places in Wales, and I've got quite a lot of places outside of Wales on the to-do list, is what I call it. It's essentially every officially recognised community, so that's town, village or settlement of some kind. I've got every hill over 300 metres. I've got all of the major rivers and waterways and lakes as well, and the county names as well, and that comes to about 5,600 places, something along those lines. Sometimes you get to a place and it's a couple of houses along a stretch of road, and it's hard to find a scene that captures the feeling of being in a place, right? That's quite difficult sometimes. Sometimes I get to a place and it's the name of a large housing estate, for example. It's just people's houses, and I don't always feel too comfortable filming people's houses. You know, I don't mind it if it's kind of in the background and it's not the main focus, but that can be quite difficult. Land ownership obviously makes things difficult. The National Trust owns quite a lot of land in Wales, and that's fine, but you've got to ask for permission. And sometimes you can be on a footpath and suddenly find yourself in private land that you shouldn't really be filming in. But I've done very well to avoid that so far. Sometimes it's just hard to get to a place. Sometimes you want to talk about a hilltop, but if there's no path up to the top of it, you can't get to it. You know, other issues with filming is obviously research. So I do quite a lot of research. Before I film a place, I look at quite a lot of the good current scholarship around the meaning of place names and that kind of thing. But obviously it's still a fairly new field in Wales, and there's not always a huge amount of resources to explain meanings of place names. So I have to take a bit of a guess and, you know, put it out there and then tell people if I don't know, you know, ask people for their ideas about what this could mean. But yeah, it can be difficult filming. The way I see it is there's something special about every place, because actually if a place wasn't special in some way, it wouldn't have a name. It would just be the area between places, right? Everywhere that I filmed has a name, so it's usually got something interesting to say about it. And I get the question a lot where people ask me, you know, what's your favourite place name? And they're all interesting for their own reasons, you know. I have various themes that I really enjoy. I really like it when a language is preserved, or a form of another language is preserved through Welsh place names. So a good example of this is like Newborough in Anglesey, Newbwrch in Welsh. Newbwrch in Welsh actually mirrors the Middle English pronunciation of the speakers of the people who originally settled there. Because after the conquest, England moved in communities of English speakers into places that were politically sensitive. So places like Conwy, places like Nyddamenai, like Carnarvon and Aberystwyth. And Newborough is one of those places, because it was originally where the princes would have had a llys, their court. So they destroyed the court and they moved English speakers there. And in Middle English, they called it the Niwa Borough, so the new borough. But Welsh speakers heard that and wrote it as Newburgh, and then preserved that form of Middle English in the name. Other examples are, for example, Conwy. Conwy, the first element is either kin, which means primary, or con, as in cown, which means reeds. And then the other form is gui, which means water, and that doesn't have a sister word in any of the Indo-European languages, so it's quite possible that element of the word conwy, as in gui, meaning waters, preserves a pre-Celtic word, a word from the language that was spoken here before the Indo-European words arrived here. And I think that's really fascinating, especially when you can find these really old words, yeah. So with place names, there's always multiple explanations for what a place name means, and there's always a bit of an overlap. You've got like the sort of scientific, linguistic approach to understanding a place name, but then along with that you also have a lot of stories attached to it. Now, Caernarfon, Caer, as in a fortress, is in, and then Arfon is the name for the area of Gwynedd, which is up against Ynys Môn, up against Anglesey. So Arfon is the name for that area. Ar is it on or by, and Vaughan is Môn, as in Anglesey. So it's the fortress in the Arfon. Now there is a story called the Breuddwyd Maxen, which records one of the last a Roman general who historically actually tried to, as far as I understand, I might be wrong, he tried to break Britain away from the Roman Empire as it was collapsing, and to run Britain as a Roman emperor. There's a story about it which comes through some of the old Welsh literature, where he dreams of standing on, he falls asleep hunting, I think, and he dreams of standing on top of a hill and seeing a castle down by the sea and a river and stuff, and it's interpreted as Caernarfon. There's a beautiful woman there called Helen, so the Welsh name for the road that goes to Caernarfon, the Roman road, was, I think it's Ffordd Helen, something like that, something Helen, and it's the name of this princess that he dreamed of being in that, and then supposedly he came there and set up his kingdom there and stuff. But it's more likely that it's just, then the place name is actually just describing the fortress which has been there since Roman times, right? As in Saguntium in the Arfon. So, you know, there's always a good, interesting story attached to it, but it doesn't necessarily line up with the linguistics of it. Sure, so Penmaen Mawr is fairly straightforward. We have Penmaen, which is a headland, and refers to that giant rock over there. Yeah, that one over there, which used to have a hill fort on top of it, called Braichadinas. And then we have Mawr, which means big, as opposed to Penmaen Fach, which is the smaller headland over there. Now, when I did my video about Penmaen Mawr, there was a couple of people who, I think it's a bit of a joke mixed with local legend, where it's just like, oh, it's because X, Y and Z who had a hangover here. He said pen, like head, Maen Mawr, it's big because Pen Mawr is a hangover. But obviously that's just people having a bit of a joke. There is a bit of a difference between place names in Wales in different areas, and it tends to line up with dialects actually. So in South Wales, for example, the word ton or tiller is a lot more common than it is in North Wales. Another really good example is the word for brook or a stream. So in North Wales we'd say glass, which sounds blue. So Dillas, for example, as in Llandillas, is the river Dillas, which goes through the middle of it. That's D as in black, and then las as in a stream, glass. In the south they pronounce it Glais. So there's a place called Dowlais, just outside Merthyr Tydfil. And that's dough as in D, as in black, and then Glais. So it's the same as Dillas, it's just in a different dialect. So yeah, there are differences. Obviously there's a lot more similarities, you know, things like Llan and Caer and Thre are all very similar. But if you go into sort of the frequencies of certain elements of place names, yeah, there's differences. Yeah, absolutely. I have several very good, reliable sources, and I strongly suggest it to anyone who is wanting to read up on the subject. So there's a couple of authors. Richard Morgan, he has a series of place names of X, where he goes through certain counties and shires. He does some really fantastic, very scientific, serious research on it. And then a guy called Hywelwyn Owen, who's a lecturer, or was a lecturer, I'm not sure anymore, in place name studies, and he also does quite a lot of very in-depth place name studies in a very scientific and scholarly way. Now, there are other writers as well, and I found them all to be fairly good. They all make reasoned hypotheses on the meaning of place names. But Richard Morgan and Howell Wyn-Owen really are the sort of top level scholars in that area. But then also we have other stuff where we have writers from the 1800s who would say myth as though it was fact, and that has messed up the sort of the field a little bit. So a lot of the time when I put a video out, I tried to cover all of the possible options, and I tried to come to my own conclusion on it. You know, I look at the sort of reasoning that has been given behind why a name would change, or whether or not it fits in with the way that languages change over time, or whether it fits in with the reality of an area. You know, if it's talking about a pont that's not there, then it's probably not originally pont. This happens a lot with the word llan. So there's a lot of llans out there, like Llanfarian in Ceredigion, where there's no llan there at all. And historically there's been no llan, but it's probably originally Nant that's changed over time.
What does llan mean?
Llan is an area or settlement attached to a church. It's okay, it's one of my, so I say it quite a lot in my videos, yeah. So a llan is an area or a settlement attached to a church. Now, it's a really interesting word actually, because originally a llan meant a specific kind of sacred space created by early saints to make a new church. So the story is that they would go to a place and fast for 40 days and pray a lot over that 40 days to make sure the area was consecrated. But then over time that changed to kind of just mean the llan enclosure itself, which was as a kind of traditional Welsh enclosure for churches, where you'd have all of the church buildings attached to the church. So the guy who would run the church would also live there and cook and have a small bit of farm there, that kind of thing. But then over time it's also come to just mean any settlement attached to a church, or an area even. Sometimes the settlement didn't work out but the church remained, or the church also didn't work out and then the area was just called llan something. So it changes a lot over time, yeah. Everywhere's home to somebody, right? So I always get people, oh, do X, Y, and Z next, and rest assured, if anyone's watching this, it probably is on the list. If it's a recognised town or village or hamlet, if it's on the Welsh Language Commissioner's list of place names that's officially recognised, I will do it eventually. But it depends on the logistics of getting to places usually. So I want to go everywhere already. I want to have already been to everywhere, right? But it's about whether or not I get there, because I don't drive. Obviously, walking and public transport makes places a little bit inaccessible sometimes, but I will get there eventually. Yeah, so there's a couple of areas. Basically, between Conwy and Prestatyn, that whole coastal area I've done because that's within walking distance of where I live. So my first large selection of videos that came out, my first large series of videos that came out was in that area because it was within walking distance of the bus stops. I take the number 12 up and down the coast, and I kind of everywhere within walking distance of the coast has been done now, except for obviously Flintshire, which is a bit further away, and then we obviously Gwynedd, which is a bit more mountainous and harder to get into. But yeah, I'm quite comfortably, I can comfortably say I've done everywhere between Conwy and Prestatyn, yeah. It's complicated because essentially place names do change over time, right? And things like Denbighshire is quite an old place name, but it was replaced with Clwyd and then turned back into Denbighshire afterwards. So what you actually find is that there's a cultural memory of a selection of place names to describe an area, and then they kind of turn up again over time, even if the original thing's gone. So, you know, you see it in places like street names, for example. Creuddyn is a good example of this. Creuddyn is the original name for the cwmwd, the Cmote, the sort of subdivision of a cantref in medieval Wales, and it covered the area between the flat land where Llandudno is now and also the Orme. And then obviously after the conquest it was just integrated wholesale into Gwynedd, I believe, for a long time, and it wasn't really used as a common name. But then as Llandudno expanded, Creuddyn came back into it. It was chosen as the name for the local school, it was chosen as the name for a couple of roads in the area. So as long as the cultural memory's there, generally people don't make up completely new names for places. but sometimes they do, right? So you have to look at it a case-by-case basis. But yeah, names change. Names change. I'm looking at doing street names and these sort of smaller, they're called micro-toponyms, to be really fancy about it. These small things like field names, farm names, and road names. Now, beforehand, obviously I've got quite enough on my plate when it comes to every single settlement, river and hill in Wales, right? But I am looking at it because some of them are very, very interesting. But I need to find a better format for them. So I found that there's already a lot of good information out there on Welsh place names of towns and stuff, right? But sometimes it would be, people would spend too long going about it, and I found that shorts were a really good amount of time for it. You've got 3 minutes, I can explain the place name to my best of my ability, I can give some different ideas if they come up. I can talk about mythology or stories. I've got a bit of space to talk about a place, but I don't have too long to ramble about, the mill that was built in 1850 and then destroyed in 1864 by X, Y, and Z family, etc. It keeps me quite concise, right? And some people don't like that because obviously their bit of history that they're really interested in is the bit that gets cut out, right? Otherwise, they're happy about the video. But trying to find, I think with these micro-toponyms like farms and field names, it's very difficult to film sometimes. Like, if I've got a field with a very interesting place name, what footage do I have to cover that? How long do I talk about it? How long can you talk about it? I think if I can find a way of packaging these smaller names, like street names and stuff, into a good video that still keeps people interested, I will. Because there's always something interesting. I've thought about maybe going on like a street name safari. So, going out and saying this street is called this because of this. This street is this because of this. But trying to find a good way of connecting them narratively and trying to find a good way of showing these streets without it just being people's recycling bins and stuff. That's the trick. If I can find a good way of doing it, I'd love to do it. But finding a good way of doing it first is the main thing for it, I think. Yeah, so I've been approached by more mainstream media. I've done some work already with S4C. I did a little bit of sort of, just general talking about place names around Wrexham, the Eisteddfod there. That was very fun. I was on Am Dro, which is, going for a walk with people and showing people your Milltir Square. It was a bit of competition. That was really great as well. I'm currently talking to someone, and I can't name names, about maybe doing a longer series. I think it's going to be based on online, and I think it's going to be based around a mix of place names and history and stuff, but I can't really talk too much about that at the moment. I have been approached by other groups as well, talking about doing similar-ish things, talking about place names and history and that kind of thing, which is very flattering because I'm not sure I can express it myself, but I fully control everything with my own videos. But I don't know. I guess people, I don't know. Yeah, I've been approached by a few people. The thing is a lot of people see my channel and they think Welsh place names, but that's not exactly my entire interest. Actually, I love language, right? I've always done work with language. I speak, English, and I speak Chinese, and a bit of Russian, and a bit of Persian, and I love language, right? And place names obviously gives me a really great outlet to explore that interest. And obviously, I love Wales. I love it's my homeland. This is where I'm from. I'm very proud to be, to speak Welsh and to what level I do. I'm very proud of where we live and where we come from, and showing our traftadaeth, our heritage, our culture and our history and our language to people from outside of Wales too. But at the same time, I do like exploring English place names. I was in Shropshire for a while, doing a bit of filming there, and I explored a lot of very interesting old English place names, and I've been doing some planning as well to explore other Celtic languages. So I'm looking at maybe going to Ireland at some point to look at some of the Gaelic place names, I should say. It's not Gaelic, that's Scotland. We're going to Scotland to explore the sort of Pictish, Old Norse, Gaelic mix that is really fascinating up there. Cumbria would be really fun because, again, it's a mix of Brythonic, Viking, Old English. Absolutely fascinating. Cornwall is on my to-do list, absolutely, because Cornish is a really fascinating... I love Cornish. It's a really great language, and I'd love to explore that in Brittany as well. But to be honest, I've already begun the planning for places in other countries as well. I did some planning for a series of videos in New England because it'd be really good to explore the indigenous names there. Places like Connecticut, you know, as well as lots of place names I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I've identified a few and I've begun doing the research for it. Australia would be fascinating. Go and look at the Aboriginal names there. China, it'd be good to go back to China and show these place names in Chinese there as well. You know, the good thing is with the format of talking about place names is it gives me a license to really talk about whatever I want, really, because everywhere's got a place name. So if I want to talk about the history of a place, I can do that through its place name. If I want to talk about linguistics or an interesting etymology, where a word has come from, I can do that through place names as well. And also, it can be applied anywhere. It doesn't just have to be in Wales. You know, I'd love to explore England and Scotland, Cornwall, Brittany, France, Germany, Russia, China, maybe not Russia at the moment. Japan would be really interesting, Malaysia, everywhere's got something interesting to say, yeah. When words are similar to each other, right, sometimes imagine that you've got two circles, sometimes they're completely different. Sometimes there is overlap, but they kind of sometimes also have different meanings. So an example of this is Cwm and Dyffryn. So a valley, right? A Dyffryn generally is a flat-bottomed valley with a large river through the middle of it, and a Cwm tends to be steeper. But sometimes that doesn't actually apply as well. But most of the time that's the difference. But then sometimes you do have pure synonyms, words which are almost exactly the same but are just different words. But generally it's a mix of those two, yeah. There's something really interesting you can do with this, actually, with Paleolinguistics, which is the study of languages in the past. Now, one of the things they wanted to do was they wanted to find out where the Indo-European languages come from. So, Indo-European languages, basically most of the languages in northern India, through the Middle East, up to Europe, are all related to each other. They have a common ancestor from about 6,000 years or so ago. Not exactly, but whatever. But one of the things is they wanted to work out where this language had originally come from. So what they did is they looked at all the different languages under this language family, and from that they managed to work out that some names of trees were shared but others weren't, and some names of animals were shared but others weren't. And then by cross-referencing which animals and plants and trees were shared amongst all of the Indo-European languages, they could work out a rough range for where that language came from, because it had all of those words for those specific things. They didn't have to borrow those words. So from that, they managed to work out roughly where the Indo-European languages came from, which is really fascinating. And that kind of works on a lower level as well. So if you look at shared vocabulary between Irish and Welsh, for example, you can actually work out when some concepts were brought into a place and some might have been brought into a place, right? And when sometimes they were borrowed from other places. So, for example, the Brythonic languages, the ancestor to Welsh, it did actually borrow quite a lot of Latin into it. So there's about 12-15% of modern Welsh, actually, and some words that people wouldn't know, like rhaid and eisiau, actually are borrowed from Latin. But that borrowing seems to have happened at the end of the Roman occupation. So what we can know from that is that it's quite likely that the loan words into the Brythonic languages weren't happening while during the Roman occupation. What happened was after the Romans had left and the Saxons had arrived, people fled as refugees from these areas, and it was in that period when actually a lot of the borrowing happened, which is absolutely fascinating. You know, you can do quite a lot of interesting stuff by looking at what words cover which places and what words are borrowed into which languages. A lot of people say this to me. They go, there's a saying, it's like Welsh is the oldest language in Europe. And it's like, every language in Europe is the oldest language in Europe, because languages change over time, right? In the same way that modern English is quite different to early modern English, the way that, Dickens wrote. We don't really speak like that anymore. It's the same way it's different to Chaucer's in Middle English. The same is really different to Beowulf, which is Old English. Welsh has the same thing. Modern spoken Welsh is different to early modern Welsh, is different to Middle Welsh, is different to Old Welsh, is different to Brythonic. And when people say that it's the oldest language, it's like, well, if a Brythonic speaker came to you and started speaking, you wouldn't necessarily understand more than 20% of what they're saying. In the same way that if you spoke English and spoke to an Old English speaker, you might get a couple of words, but it's not really understandable. Is that the same language then? And at what point do you end that? Because you could go back to Indo-European and say, well, Spanish is the oldest language in Europe because it comes from Latin. Okay, but also Latin comes from Indo-European, so English comes from Indo-European, Welsh comes from Indo-European. Does that make any of them the oldest language? It doesn't really work like that. All languages change over time. So, yeah, the way that modern Welsh is used, and actually you can see this in place names as well. Our river names preserve very, very old forms of languages, and that happens in every language. It's a very interesting thing about river toponymy. We have words like the Rhine, for example, in German. The word Rhine is possibly related to a Celtic root to do with the word to run, to move quickly, rhad, like rhadag. The same as Rheidol in Aberystwyth. The same as quite a few other river names. But if you look at the forms of it, you can see that it preserves these older forms, and it might be preserving Brythonic rather than a Welsh form, if that makes sense. So words like Alad and Elwi, they include very old roots that are to do with the word to go or to bend, that we don't use in modern Welsh anymore, but are preserved in these old river names. So you can find out quite a lot about older forms of languages through rivers. The thing is all languages have these old roots. There's no new language, right? And I know that people are like, oh, well, the way the kids are speaking it these days, that's always happened. Aristotle complained about the way that the children back then were speaking Greek, because it was different to what he was used to and different to the standard. And the idea of that Welsh is the oldest language, I think, comes from Romanticism, really, from the 1800s. It comes from a sense of wanting to show the importance and the heritage of the Welsh language to people who often didn't value the Welsh language. We're talking about, the academic elite, let's say, in the 1800s, didn't really value our language that much. So they tried to compare it to things like Latin and compare it to, it's this ancient language X, Y, and Z, even though it's got value in of itself. And I think that's where it comes from. It feels like Iolo Morgannwg. There's a lady called Sophia, or Sophie Gala, who has a very interesting saying about this. And she says that languages don't die, they're killed. And they can be killed by various things, happenstance, like, the natural disasters, but sometimes it's part of a state and cultural repression. With Welsh, I don't think it's dying. I don't think that's the right way to look at it, but it has been under a lot of pressure over the last 600 years or so. Originally, Welsh was in a system which valued it. The uchelwyr, the nobles, the noblemen in medieval Wales would patronise poets and singers and writers, and it was part of a big cultural milieu which supported the language, and it was the normal spoken language for people for a long, long time. And after the conquest and the laws in Wales were changed, so suddenly you couldn't use the Welsh language in the legal system, you had to do it in English, even if you didn't speak it, which meant people were disenfranchised. Suddenly the narrative around it changed from this is our language and this is what it is, to this is a minority language that has no place in the modern world. And the treachery of the Blue Books is a good example of this. It's where people had come to Wales from England and had said that the Welsh language makes people immoral. It makes our women loose and all sorts of crazy stuff like that. But it comes from being part of a culture that has been subsumed by another larger culture as a neighbour, and it creates a lot of these stories and I'm going to say memes, these ideas, these phrases that people come out with Welsh is a dying language. Well, there's more Welsh speakers now than there were in the Middle Ages in terms of raw numbers, but obviously in terms of percentages, it's changed quite significantly. But the world has changed quite significantly. You know, you get these things, these reasons. Oh, Welsh doesn't have a word for X, Y, or Z. I've heard that for minority languages all around the world. I remember when I was in China, in Shanghai, they were like, oh, well, Shanghainese doesn't really have the word for X. And I'm like, well, it does. You just don't know it. Do you know what I mean? You can make a new word for it. Languages do change over time. They can create stuff. But Welsh has been under a lot of pressure for the last few hundred years, and thankfully things feel, at least, like they're turning around a bit at the moment. There's a bit of hope in the air. You know, I think a lot of the old divisions between English-speaking Wales and Welsh-speaking Wales have melted away a bit. You can see it happening in Northern Ireland as well, actually. I was watching a video the other day of a farmer who's a Protestant from County Down. You know, we're talking deep Northern Ireland. He's been out learning Gaelic and speaks Gaelic as well, and because that old community division has broken down in the time that we're in now. And I think that's happening here. I think if I spoke to my granddad about it, he'd be like, well, we speak English and they speak Welsh. And it would be this whole, like, them and us kind of thing. But now I have many friends who speak Welsh as a first language. I have friends who speak English as a first language. Welsh has become quite cool. You know, a lot of my friends are all learning it and they're picking it up. And I think there's been a bit of a sea change. I can't say why that is, but it feels like there has been. Miscommunication of Welsh words, it happens quite a lot, and this is what happens, I feel, when you view the Welsh language through the eyes of someone who doesn't speak it. It gets sort of a layer of exoticism, which is sometimes played up on. Sometimes it's just fun, you know, I can't blame people for using it. But sometimes it's for money, actually, as well. A good example of this is Llanfair Pwllgwyngyll. The original name is Llanfair Pwllgwyngyll. It's not Llanfair Pwllgwyngyll Gagere Chwyr yn Drobl Llantysilio Goch. It was called that because of a hotel owner who wanted more people to stop off at the railway and stay at his hotel. So he created this long name, which at the end here it doesn't really make sense actually. Goch is borrowed from a place in Carmarthenshire, the Red Cave. There's no Red Cave near Llanfair Pwllgwyngyll. But there's this whole spectacle of this other language. Look how crazy this language is. Look how insane and unpronounceable and irrational it is. Let's go and have a look at it. It creates a spectacle of the language. And it's the same thing with Pop-de Ping and Pysgod Wibbly Wobbly is the other one. They're children's words. Nobody would call it a Pysgod Wibbly Wobbly, a jellyfish, is a sgleifren amor. A Pop-de Ping is a macrodon, really. It'd be kind of like if I was to go, look how crazy the English language is. What's a zigzag? What's a biscotti? Is it a biscuit or is it spaghetti? Wow, what a crazy language. And it's not all languages are rational, normal things. Everyone uses them in a normal way. But I feel that sometimes people have kind of fetishized. They've kind of created an image of the Welsh language as this unpronounceable thing that they can make jokes of on Top Gear. But it's not that. It's a normal language like every other language. And the fact that people have to go out of the way to defend it is kind of an implication about the kind of cultural environment that we've been in for the last few hundred years, yeah. Welsh cuisine, the thing is, as with all cuisines, it's largely influenced by its natural surroundings, right? So the cuisines of every country and place tend to be influenced by what's available. And in Wales, we have a very similar natural landscape as England does, as Scotland, as a lot of Northern Europe. So cheese, meats, etc., etc. But because we see British cuisine as the standard in Britain, and that's usually English cuisine, people like to say things like, oh, Wales doesn't really have a cuisine of its own. And it's like, well, it does. It's just shared with the rest of Britain, you know, pies, roast meats, roast dinners, that kind of thing. We do have some unique recipes, but I feel they're played up on a bit. So lava bread is quite a traditional one for Wales. It's like seaweed and oats fried through into a biscuit with like bacon grease. That's traditional, but again, it was eaten across Britain, across Northern Europe. I like iau ynys môn, that's quite good, Anglesey eggs. It's sort of mustard mash with boiled eggs and cheese and then baked. That's quite nice. A lot of pepper, a lot of like, you know, leek. You can put leek in it and fry leek through and put that into the mash. That makes it quite nice too. There's a bit of a movement at the moment about trying to define a specific Welsh cuisine, but it's quite difficult because we're part of a larger thing. We have our own dishes as part of a larger North European cuisine, let's say, but you know, I think there's some really great stuff going on with mussels, with seafood, especially in Wales, because we tend to be a bit better with that kind of seafood here than England does seem to be sometimes, but it's still growing, and like all cuisines, it's being redefined by other cuisines that have impacted the area. You know, I saw there's a guy called Chris from Carnarvon who does some really, really good cooking, and it's sort of like global, it's mixed cooking. You know, he made shawarma out of Welsh lamb and used Welsh ingredients for it, and it all looks absolutely delicious. But yeah, we do have our own cuisine, but it's part of a shared cuisine, let's say. I learned quite a lot about Welsh mythology through what I'm doing. Now, I was kind of familiar with it anyway. You know, I'd read the Mabinogi, and I read some of the old, the Red Book of Carmarthen stories and some of the Arthurian stuff beforehand anyway. But it's always nice to tie it into a place. But the problem is, as well, is that some mythology is always fascinating as a story, but I always try not to overemphasize it in what I do, because it can often conflict with the facts of a place, if that makes sense. Now, a good example of this is King Arthur. It was originally a Brythonic figure, so you know, I think Wales does have a fairly good claim to him being a Welsh figure originally. But in the 1800s, people had a bit of a habit of renaming places after him. So there's a place called Bwrdd Arthur, or Cegin Arthur is another example, up and down in Gwynedd. And, you know, people love to mythologise these places, and that was named after King Arthur. It was a fairly common name for a while. It could be any Arthur. It could be any Caradog is a good example, another one. Caradog is a fairly common name, but there's a Caer Caradog in Shropshire, outside Church Stretton. And they like to say, no, that's Caradog, as in the guy who led the resistance against the Romans, even though there's zero evidence for that. Do you know what I mean? There's no primary sources that say that Caradog fought in Shropshire against the Romans. They describe him fighting in a hill fort, but that could be anywhere, right? But I think there's a tendency with people, and it's perfectly understandable. Everyone wants to feel like their home is special in some way, right? And it creates a kind of incentive for people to mythologise the place names around them. And that's how also happened throughout history as well. So you can have text from the 1600s which describes the local hill fort. Like, for example, there's a place called Pendinas, just south of Aberystwyth. And in the 1600s, a guy wrote a book called About the Giants of Britain. And he says, well, this is where the giant Maelor lived. So this is Dinas Maelor. And he lived here with his sons, and he comes up with a story about him riding his horse really fast and pulling his dog's head off. But you have to treat that as mythologisation. You can't be like, okay, we're looking for giants' bones up on that hill fort because there's a story about giants. And people, it's really old, you know, and it gives quite a lot of historical quite historical backing, like, for these places, because people can say that these names have come from the Middle Ages, from before the Middle Ages, but that doesn't mean that people back then were that different to us now. I think people just really like coming up with cool stories to explain the name of where they live, because it adds to the prestige of where they live. And that happens even now. In Denbigh, for example, I did a video on Denbigh, or in Welsh, Dinbych. Din is a fortress. Bych is an old form of Middle Welsh, bach, small. So it just means the small fortress. And you can see it through the historical forms, but the amount of people I got saying, you know, actually, it means dim bych, as in bych, as in boars, because they hunted all the boars and there was no boars in the area. Dim bych. And okay, but bych has never meant boars. I can't find that anywhere, right? Or bych was the name of a dragon who was killed by a giant here. I'm like, that's a really great story, and I love these stories, don't get me wrong, but it just doesn't really line up with where things are, you know, and the things that people's teachers told them. The amount of stories that get passed on that way is fascinating and interesting on its own, but it doesn't always line up with the facts. fascinating. And actually, this actually ties into the mythology of it as well. So a lot of the time, so there have been various groups of people who've moved into the area, built things, and then been absorbed into other groups or superseded or killed, right? The Bronze Age things and Iron Age things, there's a really cool thing with place names where sometimes they're described as either something belonging to giants or something belonging to the Irish. So the name for the old Iron Age roundhouses just outside of Holyhead was Cwtiar Gwyddelod, which is the huts of the Irishmen, because the people had seen them, they hadn't known who made them, and they thought, oh well, it's not us who made it, so who did? Maybe the Irish. We'll call it the Irishmen's huts, right? Another example is hill forts are often associated with giants. So there's Castell Cawr just behind Abergele, and that means the castle of the giant. But it's probably because people, long after the hill fort's use wasn't obvious, people wanted to explain why there was stone ramparts up on top of the hill behind them. So they're like, okay, well, it can't be the Irish, maybe the English, or maybe giants. Castell Cawr, the castle of the giant. Tre'r is a good example, a huge Iron Age town, the remains of it, up on the top of a hill by the Llyn. And Tre'r just means the town of the giants, because people had seen these ruins and didn't necessarily have the access to information that we do today, and they mythologize it, right? They create an explanation for these things, which they then pass on. And you can see that in place names quite a lot, where you can see how these myths build up over time. There are Welsh castles all the way through. They're called native castles generally. So there's a really beautiful one called Castell y Berra. It's built into the stone up in the south of Gwynedd, I think. Dolbadarn is a Welsh castle. There are Welsh castles, and they tend to have been built in the later Middle Ages, but we have to remember as well that the large stone castles were really a late medieval thing, 1400s. Even in England, they had mottes and bailey castles, these wooden ramparts. It's kind of if you stopped one group of people building castles just before those kind of castles became popular. So if the conquest didn't happen, we'd absolutely have had castles, but we do have our own. Even places like Ewlow, way out on the border towards Queensferry, that's a Welsh castle built by Welsh people. But as well, we didn't have the same, as far as I understand it, I could be wrong, right, but we didn't have the same requirement to brutally control areas of land here. We didn't need to build castles on every crossing, because people here didn't feel the need to rebel against it. They built Conwy and Caernarfon to control politically powerful areas of Wales. We didn't have to build castles to defend against ourselves that much. But we do have castles, yeah. Essentially, when England came in, they didn't build castles and then let Welsh people sit in the castles. They tended to bring in their own settlers, who were a mix of, Middle English speaking and Normans and royalty, and sometimes even the Flemish. In Pembrokeshire, a lot of the Normans invited quite a lot of Flemish people across to south of Pembrokeshire to settle. But yeah, generally the castles weren't great places to be Welsh. Sometimes you were allowed in on market days, like Aberystwyth. Conwy ejected all of the Welsh monks there and moved them down to Maenam because they didn't want them in the castle. And they created these the idea was that it would create an area of English power and dominance, which would then slowly expand out from there. But that didn't always work, because obviously if you left the castle, nobody spoke your language, so people learned Welsh and they became Welsh again over time. But it's taken hundreds of years, yeah. Yeah, essentially I'm continuing on as I am. I've recently managed to get enough patrons who thankfully, very thankfully, support me in my work. But I've managed to make enough now that I can actually afford to go on further distances. I don't drive, which makes things difficult, obviously, but now I can afford to go to a place on the bus or on the train and do some filming in a slightly different area. So from now on, I'm probably going to be moving more away from the North Coast, start going into South Wales a lot, going into Mid Wales a lot. I'm planning on doing some long form videos on YouTube specifically. I'm looking at maybe doing the Offers Dyke Trail and exploring the place names along the border and the history there. in some more long-form content. That's what I'm planning on doing. I'm in the middle of writing a couple of booklets, actually. I'm looking at doing a sort of guide to the cantrefi. So before the conquest, we had smaller units of land called cantrefi. And each one is kind of a nice small packet, an area that you can tie into historical buildings and historic standing stones and all this interesting stuff, and kind of creating a sort of guidebook to each of the cantrefi. So that people will know then, you know, there's a cool church here, there's a standing stone here, there's woods here, there's ruins of a mill here, all the interesting things in a local area, in people's myth square, because I think there's so much to see in Wales that you just won't hear about most of the time, because it's not on the main sort of tourist path. But you know, there's churches up in the hills at the back here from the 6th century, really ancient stuff that nobody goes to because it's slightly out of the way. So I'm trying to create a series of books that describe that. I've got some merch coming together as well, but basically I'm just going to keep on keeping on because I've still got 5,000 plus place names to finish. So I'd really like to get out to Cornwall and Brittany. I think that'd be particularly interesting to my audience in Wales because of the similarities between place names, like Llandyrnog in Denbighshire. Well, Llandyrno in Brittany is the same saint, it's the same word, it's the same meaning. And I think it'd be really interesting to kind of show people these other places that are related to where we're from, without necessarily being in where we're from, if that makes sense. I'd love to go abroad a bit more. I'd love to go and to show people a couple of the place names away. So, for example, the most distant, unique Welsh name for a place is probably Istanbul. It's Caer Costennin in Welsh. So it's Caer, the fortress of Constantine, who's the name of the emperors who obviously gave his name to the Greek name Constantinopolis. I think it'd be really interesting to explore places like that, or the Celtic names way out on the fringes of Europe. It's places like Germany and Poland and Romania. They occasionally have river names and village names that are from Celtic roots. And if I could go out and explore those places and then bring them back and show people that, look, the Rhine is named from a Celtic root and it means X, Y, and Z. Yeah, that'd be really exciting. So I'm on most of the social media platforms. So I'm on YouTube under Tirlun, Tirlun. If you search it, you'll find it. I'm on Facebook, I'm on TikTok, and I'm on Instagram as well. I appreciate follows on all of those things. I have a website, which is www.tirlun.com, and it's just basically links to my social media pages at the moment. But I am planning on doing some stuff there as well. And then also I do have a Patreon. If people want to support me, I really appreciate that. It helps me get out and making videos because I can no longer just take the bus to places. I have to go out a bit further, so it's getting more expensive. And all the money I'm making at the moment goes into making my videos as well. Just get in contact with me. Yeah, you can find me on social media. That's it. Diolch.